Good morning to everyone joining us on this very special day. We are honored to share with you the main findings of this report titled 7 Years of Final Accord Implementation, Perspectives to Strengthen Peace Building at the Halfway Point. My name is Josefina Chavarria, and I'm a professor of the practice and director of the Peace Accords Matrix at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Today, in this online seminar, I am joined by 7 representatives from the Barometer Initiative team in Colombia, including the regional barometers, and from the University of Notre Dame. Nicolás Rojas, the Strategic Relationship Building Specialist. Yvonne Zúñiga, researcher of the Ethnic Approach and Point 6 on verification. Tatiana Menjura, researcher for Point 1 on rural reform and Point 4 on solving the problem of illicit drugs. Natalia Restrepo, researcher of Point 5 on victims. Alejandro Roballo, researcher of Point 2 on political participation. Alison Kilholt, research associate of the Peace Accords Matrix. And Enrique Gutierrez, researcher of Point 3 on the end of the conflict. Good morning to you all. The Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies is part of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame and is a leading center for research and studies in peace building worldwide. At the Kroc Institute, we find the Peace Accords Matrix, PAM, which constitutes the most comprehensive database on the implementation of 34 peace agreements negotiated around the world since 1989. By mandate of the government of Colombia and the former FARC-EP guerrillas, signatories of the final agreement for the termination of the armed conflict and the construction of a stable and lasting peace, the Kroc Institute is responsible for monitoring the implementation of the entire accord. Within the framework of responsibility entrusted to us by the high signatory parties, I am pleased to inform you that the Kroc Institute has now produced 8 annual reports. Now, during the next 90 minutes, we want to provide you with an overview of the current state of implementation of the final agreement and share with you key data and analysis that you will find explained in greater detail by reading the text, which is already available on our website. First, we want to share with you some key factors in the context of the report's period of analysis from December 2022 until November 2023, as we believe these factors are essential to understand the dynamics of implementation. This will be followed by a discussion of the main findings of the report. Next, we will discuss the findings of our international comparative analysis, which has taken a special approach to the component of reintegration or reincorporation of ex-combatants. After this global overview, we will narrow our focus to the Colombian case and share with you our quantitative findings. We will delve into the gender and ethnic cross-cutting approaches, as well as the territorial approach, with fresh and first-hand information that comes from our regional barometers. Today, in presenting this annual report, we would like to guide our presentation towards a comprehensive and integral view of the final accord. Therefore, instead of presenting the individual findings for each of the points of the agreement, we would rather zoom the progress, challenges, and opportunities through the lenses of 3 thematic areas. First, territorial transformation, which brings together the findings of the implementation of Point 1 on integral rural reform and Point 4 on the solution to the problem of illicit drugs. Secondly, the thematic area of strengthening democracy and institutional adaptation for implementation, bringing together the implementation information from Point 2 on political participation and Point 6 on verification and public endorsement. And a third thematic is centered on the guarantees for reincorporation, the exercise of politics, and the satisfaction of the rights of victims through the analysis of the implementation of Point 3 on end of conflict and Point 5 on victims. Finally, we will outline the opportunities identified by the Kroc Institute to advance the implementation of the final accord. We trust that these insights will be invaluable to civil society, implementation agencies at both national and territorial levels, and the international community. This presentation will last approximately 1 hour, after which we will open the floor to a question and answer session with questions submitted by the audience, both during and prior to the launch. We ask that you use the Q&A function of the chat here on your Zoom screens to please send us your questions and queries. Without further delay, let's begin this presentation. I would like to ask Nicolás Rojas if he could please tell us about the analysis period of the report, the context in which implementation progressed in 2023, and present the main findings of our annual report. Nicolás, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josefina. Well, as usual, the Kroc Institute includes a context section where we present various political, economic, and social events that shape the implementation of the final accord. On this occasion, the Institute identified 5 main contextual events. First, the country continued to experience armed conflict. The International Committee of the Red Cross warned of the existence of 8 non-international armed conflicts. 3 of these correspond to confrontations with the state's armed forces. Additionally, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights noted an increase in the number of massacres by 6.5% compared to 2022. Furthermore, human rights violations, such as displacement and confinement, continue to occur, mainly affecting ethnic communities. A second event we highlighted in the report is that the government's agenda was focused on implementing the total peace policy. And even though one of its components is the implementation of the peace accord, the truth is that the most of the efforts were focused on the negotiation held with different armed groups to bring a comprehensive and sustainable peace to the country. To give you a brief review of the ongoing dialogues, 4 were held with the National Liberation Army, ELN in Spanish. The negotiation table with the Central Command of the FARC-EP was installed, and urban conversation tables were set up in Medellin, Buenaventura, and Quibdó. Agreements were reached at these tables, such as national bilateral ceasefire with the ELN at the High Command, and the establishment of the National Participation Committee at the negotiation table with the ELN. Despite this progress in negotiation, the process continues to experience many challenges. A third contextual event we pointed out was the declaration by the Constitutional Court of the unconstitutional state of affairs regarding the security situation of leaders, defenders, and human rights advocates. The Constitutional Court had an opportunity to examine several complaints of leaders, defenders, and human rights advocates who considered that their right to protect human rights wasn't being guaranteed by the Colombian government. The court granted the right to protect fundamental rights due to the lack of measures and institutional capacity to address this situation. Fourth, the National Development Plan, Colombia, a World Power of Life, was approved in May of the last year. This plan includes measures that can improve the implementation of the peace accord. For example, it allocated a budget of 50.4 trillion pesos, nearly $13 billion, for the implementation of the peace accord. Also, regarding the institutional architecture of implementation, the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace was reformed. Oti Patiño was appointed as the new High Commissioner, and the Unit for the Implementation of the Final Peace Accord was created, and it's in charge of coordinating and ensuring the implementation of the 2016 Peace Accord. Likewise, the Ministry of Equality and Equity was created, The Kroc Institute considers the creation of this entity an opportunity to promote gender and ethnic approaches in the implementation of the final accord. Finally, the Kroc Institute highlighted the regional elections that were held in October of 2023. We pointed out how during these elections there was an increase in the political violence against candidates and also an increase in the participation of signatories of the final accord. 144 signatories participate as candidates during this election, in contrast to the 101 participated in 2019. As for the question regarding the main findings, Josefina, the Kroc Institute highlighted on this report 5 of them. First, the report shows how the implementation of the final accord has not stopped. However, the report also presents the difficulties to ensure its viability. One of the main challenges is to strengthen implementation based on the principle of comprehensiveness and territorialization. A second finding is related to the approval of the National Development Plan. As I mentioned previously, the National Development Plan incorporates different plans and programs included in the final accord. Therefore, its effective and timely execution could increase implementation levels. A third finding shows that institutional efforts have been directed towards strengthening trust and fostering dialogues with communities. Different ways to enhance participation and dialogues have been pursued to rebuild trust in the peace accord. Our fourth finding, as will be further explained during this presentation by my colleagues, warns as to how the lowest levels of implementation continue to be those related with point 1, comprehensive rural reform, point 2, political participation, as well as for the commitments regarding the cross-cutting gender and ethnic approaches. Finally, the Kroc Institute highlights the importance of adopting measures to ensure transparency, systematicity, and coherence in data made public by the government and its agencies. This would not only help increase the implementation levels, but also the trust that Colombian people have in the implementation process. Those, Josefina, are the 5 main findings you will find in the report.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for providing this explanation that helps us grasp the context of the implementation, as well as the significant insights from the Kroc Institute. These insights, as you just heard, not only offer a retrospective look, but also encourage us to consider future directions. And actually, this is the reason why we have given the title to our report, 7 Years of Final Accord Implementation, Perspectives to Strengthen Peace Building at the Halfway Point. Also, I would like to note that many of these major insights can also be read on our policy brief that is available on our English website. I would now like to move on to a discussion of the Kroc Institute's findings regarding an international comparative quantitative analysis. Alison, could you please tell us more about that?
Of course, Josefina. Before presenting our comparative analysis, I would like to talk about the PAM methodology. As mentioned earlier, the Peace Accords Matrix monitors the implementation of 34 comprehensive peace agreements. To do this, we reviewed and categorized the content of 34 accords into 51 major topics or provisions. These provisions were assigned a numerical value between 0 and 3 to mark their level of implementation. This allows us to calculate an aggregate implementation score for each of the agreements. And this was conducted retroactively for up to 10 years of monitoring after the signing of each agreement. Now, with the Barometer Initiative in Colombia, we have adapted this methodology to be able to monitor 578 commitments or stipulations in real time. We have grouped the stipulations into 30 PAM provisions, which allows us to compare the implementation of Colombia's agreement with the other 34 accords in our database. Making this comparison, we find the following. First, none of the 34 agreements in the PAM database have achieved a score of 100. Also, it is common for the rate of implementation to slow down at various stages in the implementation process. We found that 34 agreements, 16 of the 34 agreements, 16 or 47% have achieved an aggregate score of above 80. Of these 16 high-scoring agreements, 13 did not experience stagnation before reaching a score of 80. To clarify, we understand a period of stagnation as a year or more in which no changes in implementation scores are registered. So in conclusion, the agreements that achieve the highest implementation scores are those that do not experience periods of stagnation before achieving a score of 80. The Colombia agreement currently has a score of 69.5, and although it has not experienced a period of complete stagnation, it has been very close in recent years. If this occurs, it would make it less likely to achieve a score of 80 or higher. And Josefina, I will leave it there for now regarding the comparative analysis.
Alison, thank you very much. The results and analysis you have presented are very interesting as they represent a call to action to intensify efforts at this halfway point in the process to accelerate implementation and this way ensure the highest standards from a comparative perspective. This year, the annual report also includes a comparative analysis of the reintegration of ex-combatants following the signing of other comprehensive peace agreements. To tell us more about this topic as we explore it in further depth, I would like to invite Enrique Gutierrez to join the conversation. Enrique, could you please share with the audience the results of this research? Thank you.
Of course, considering the context of the dialogues between the national government and different illegal armed groups within the framework of the Total Peace Policy, on this occasion for the comparative section, we consider appropriate to analyze the reintegration component in the texts of the 34 comprehensive peace agreements that are monitored in the Peace Accords matrix of the Kroc Institute. According to a study carried out, 27 of the 34 comprehensive peace accords included the reintegration component in their texts. Moreover, 13 of these 27 accords have already completed the implementation of the reintegration component, and it took them 5 years and hours to do so. For instance, the Chapultepec Peace Accord of El Salvador, which was signed in 1992, completed the implementation of its reintegration component in 1997. It should be noted that the inclusion of the reintegration component in most of the texts of the 27 peace agreements is brief and general. For example, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement of Nepal, signed in 2006 between the national government and the Communist Party, included only one sentence regarding the creation of a special committee to attend the committee's combatants. Therefore, one of the first conclusions of this comparative analysis is that the reintegration or reincorporation component established in the Colombian Final Agreement of 2016 is one of the most detailed and comprehensive. However, the analysis also highlights some weaknesses in the text of the reintegration component of the Colombian Final Agreement in comparison with the text of the same component in other peace agreements. An example of this is the access to land for people in the reintegration or reincorporation process. Unlike the text of agreements such as the ones of Indonesia of 2005, of Guatemala in 1996, of El Salvador in 1992, the Colombian Final Agreement does not include in its text commitments associated with the access to land for people who decide to be part of the reincorporation. Consequently, given that most of FARC's former combatants are of rural origin and the majority of the productive projects and initiatives that they develop have an agricultural vocation, the Colombian government has had to overcome this situation through the adoption of different complementary instruments that recognize access to land for the reincorporation process. Nevertheless, the analysis also showed important virtues of the reintegration component established in the Colombian Final Agreement. For instance, unlike other peace accords, Final Agreement included the creation of a social and solidarity economy organization for the people in the reincorporation process, known as ECOMUN. Additionally, another significant distinction, the implementation timeframe. While almost half of the peace agreements that incorporated the reintegration component were able to implement it in an average timeframe of 5 years, the framework plan for the implementation of the Colombian Final agreement established a period of 10 years, that is, until 2026, for the implementation of the majority of indicators related to the recuperation process. This period may be extended with the possible review and updating of the indicators of the framework plan for the implementation by the Commission for monitoring, promoting, and verifying the implementation of the final agreement, CECIB. Given the recently adopted comprehensive recuperation program plans to extend implementation of its actions until 2031. Finally, the comparative section points out that although at a comparative level, the text of the Colombian Final Agreement develops an entire chapter exclusively to establish incorporation measures and guarantees for former combatants of the FARC-EP guerrilla, did not include other important elements that have had been incorporated and developed over time with the complementary instruments like COMPES 3931 of 2018 and the Comprehensive Recuperation Program. Therefore, we invite our peers and readers to review this section. And with this, I give the floor back to you, Jose.
Enrique, thank you. I really appreciate your precision because this allows us to highlight the importance of considering this or experience from other agreements when determining the scope of commitments that are essential for the consolidation of a successful reintegration or reincorporation process of combatants. This is particularly important in the current Colombian context where the government hopes to sign new peace agreements. Now we would like to share with our audience the current status of the implementation of the 2016 Colombian Peace Accord. Alison, if I may come back to you. From a quantitative perspective, could you please tell us what the Kroc Institute found for this period? Thank you.
Yes, so looking at the implementation of the final agreement, we see that as of November 2023, 32% of commitments have reached full implementation. 19% are at an intermediate level, 39% show minimal progress, and 10% have not yet been initiated. So we see that at the end of the 7th year of implementation, 49% of the commitments are either at a minimal stage or have not yet started implementation, which means that they are currently not considered viable. A comparison between November 2022 and November 2023 shows a decrease of 2 percentage points in commitments that had not been started, from 12% to 10%, and stipulations at a minimum level increased from 37 to 39%. These changes were due to, among other reasons, legislative initiatives such as the Bill to Unify Property Tax Regulation and Strengthen Municipal Autonomy, and the drive to strengthen the capacity of the territorial planning councils. Furthermore, the intermediate level of implementation decreased by 1 percentage point, and the completed level increased by a percentage point. This is explained by the consolidation of the universe of reporting missing persons and the establishment and operation of the Committee for Follow-up and Monitoring of the Truth Commission's recommendations. As we can see on the following slide, which shows the status of implementation by point, this monitoring year, points 3, end of conflict, and 6, verification mechanisms, stand out as those with the highest level of implementation, while points 1, comprehensive rural reform, and point 2, political participation, show the lowest levels. Points 4, the solution to the drug problem, and 5, victims, are in line with the general state of implementation. In this report, we highlight that during this monitoring year, all points experienced changes in their implementation levels, with the exception of point 4. We also note that points 1 and 6 were particularly dynamic as they underwent changes at all levels of implementation. We also underscore that, to a certain extent, the disparity of implementation levels across the different points are due to the nature of sequencing the complex reforms established by the Peace Accord. However, the disparity can also be attributed to implementation not occurring as effectively or comprehensively as the Accord intended. And with this, I conclude this section. Thank you, Josefina.
Alison, thank you very much for these annotations in relation to the importance of the principle of comprehensiveness in the design of the final accord. This is also how we have rearrange our presentation today to highlight as much as possible that principle that allows us to have a really much more coherent framework. Now, having addressed this overall landscape, let's now discuss the findings and the specifics of the final agreement. I would like to start with the status of implementation of both the gender and the ethnic cross-cutting approaches. Yvonne, may I ask you if you could please share with us a brief overview of what the report outlines in this regard? Thank you.
Of course, Josefina, but before sharing the main findings on the implementation of the gender and ethnic approach, this is important to know an adjustment of the method of how we report these approaches in our aid report. In this occasion, the Kroc Institute made an effort to include the qualitative analysis of the cross-cutting approaches on the 6th point of the agreement, and focus on quantitative analysis and general trends and the specific sections, the gender and ethnic approaches. And that way, we improve our comprehensive analysis of the Peace Accord. Now, regarding of the quantitative analysis of the gender approach, as you can see in the graph, during 2023, we documented changes in the commitments initiate, minimum, and intermediate. These changes are mainly due to the approval of the public policy for dismantling criminal organizations, the regularization of the agrarian jurisdiction that incorporate gender measures, and the sustained progress in credits for women. However, despite this change, remains the gap between implementing the 578 provisions of the General Agreement and the 130 provision of the gender approach. This gap is bigger in these commitments in the minimum level, which for the approach are 53, and on the general implementation are 39. Moreover, the complete one for the general agreement reached the 32%, for the gender focus only the 12%. Now, concerning the implementation of the gender approach, in this report, the Kroc Institute highlights three trends. First, the lack of guarantees for the participation of women and LGBT plus community and forums created for the final agreement. For example, on the development program in the with territorial focus, PEDER in Spanish, the special consultation mechanism for ethnic communities, as well as the lack of representation of LGBTQ plus community in some territorial peace and reconciliation councils, as we'll detail and point to in this report. Another key aspect of the gender approach is the recognition of the unpaid care economy in some policies. Such those include in the National Development Plan that will have a positive effect in the implementation of point 1. And also some reintegration projects led by UN Women, UNICEF, and the National Reintegration Agency. Finally, in the third trend in the implementation of the gender approach, the Kroc Institute documented the efforts of the government entities to promote coordination for the implementation of the gender approach, as well as the reactivation of the government high forum for gender. Now, in relation to the ethnic approach, during 2023, there were no quantitative changes in the 80 stipulations with ethnic approach, maintaining the gap with the general implementation. While in the general implementation, the complete provisions are 32, in the approach, it only reached 30%. And the most significant gap is evident in the provisions with minimal implementation, which at the general implementation level are 39, and the ethnic approach reached 61%. In terms of implementation, what we see here is a trend in both approaches, and according with the Kroc Institute methodology, these levels of implementation affect the viability of the integral implementation of the agreement. Regarding to the trends in the implementation of the ethnic approach in 2023, we also highlight 3 trends. First, we will able to document some planning activities to promote the ethnic approach. For example, the progress made in the consultation for the land survey and the harmonization plan for reintegration that were pending from 2018. However, these actions are not materialized in better implementation at the territorial level. Consequently, there is no land surveys and indigenous reservations or Afro-Colombian Community Council or a better level of implementation of the ethnic initiatives on the PDF, as we will see in point 1 of our report. Second, in November of 2023, continue the challenges in the development of the prior consultation with ethnic communities. This is due to the lack of technical and financial resources of government entities. For example, the lack of prior consultation is evident in the low levels of implementation of the collective reparation of more than 680 ethnic communities. Second, in the period of the analysis report, we documented the deterioration of the quality of the report from government on the status of the implementation of the ethnic approach, which made monitoring very difficult. For instance, in November of 2023, 51 ethnic indicators of the framework plan for implementation report in the integrated system for the post-conflict did not have updated information since March of this year. Finally, we highlight the signing of the political path for the ethnic chapter led by the Vice Presidency and the Minister of the Interior. This pact, signed by entities of the national government, is a strategy to overcome the delay in the implementation of the commitment with Afro-Colombian and indigenous and rural communities. These 22 commitments, including the pact, as well as the invitation to international cooperation to continue the support for the implementation of the ethnic approach, will require a monitoring mechanism that consolidates its progress in challenge. So that is a general overview about the implementation of the cross-cutting approaches. Josefina, back to you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you very much. Great, important annotations that you have shared with us. And we reiterate as Kroc Institute, as often as it will be necessary, that is of the utmost urgency, that all the entities responsible for the implementation to act swiftly and with determination, because the gaps between general implementation and the gender and ethnic approaches continue to grow. So we're very worried about that, and they need to be reduced. As you know, another cross-cutting approach of the peace agreement is the territorial approach. This time, thanks to our regional barometer strategy, the report includes a specific section on the territorial approach, and furthermore, territorial implementation experiences from different parts of the country and for each of the points of the agreement. Yvonne, if you could please continue sharing with us now this third dimension of a cross-cutting approach and expand on the territorial implementation. Thank you.
Josefina, since June 2022, the Kroc Institute launched a regional barometer strategy whose objective is to monitor and analyze the implementation of 34 commitments of the final agreement. For the time analyzing this report, the Kroc Institute had installed 4 regional barometers operating in 9 of the 16 PD regions. On this occasion, the report identified 4 general trends on the territorial implementation. First, although the territorial level has a basic infrastructure and institutional capacities, persists of centralization of the implementation. Then there is no enough regional autonomy, and also there is a lot of difficulties in the cooperation between the implementing entities. Second, in local and regional governments, we evidence difficulties in their budgets and technical capacity to promote territorial implementation of the peace agreement. And that is more evident in the PDS and in some of the policy to overcome the difficulties on the illicit crops. Third, unfortunately, different forms of violence perceived in territories which affect the guarantee of human rights, the compliance with international humanitarian law, and of course, difficult the implementation of the peace agreement, especially in rural areas. And for there is discrepancies between what is expected or executed by the national government and the expectation of the victims and the general population in the territories in relation to the implementation. 7 years after the signing of the final agreement, the general perception is that the territorial transformation are experiencing more delays than expected. Also, in this report, we have a section intended to present qualitative analysis of some of the territorial measures in the PDET. For example, in the analysis of point 3, we describe some aspects of the reintegration in the region of Urabá Antioqueño. Among other aspects, we identify some progress. For example, in the region, the National Agency for Reintegration implemented measures on promoting reconciliation and preventing the stigmatization of ex-combatants through the implementation of 3 territorial agendas for community reintegration. Also, the signatories of the peace agreement made a request to the Reincorporation Agency to characterize 3 places with the potential to be recognized as special areas for collective reincorporation. And finally, in the municipality of Mutatá, we documented the progress of a project, Care for Peace, We Are for Life, aimed to generate safe spaces for the prevention and care of violence against children, young people, and improve women's access to protection mechanisms against gender-based violence. But also, we document some challenge in this area in the Urabá Antioqueño. For example, difficulties on the access to land and housing for signatories of the peace agreement. Actually, in 2023, there was no economic support for housing projects for people in reintegration process. And also there was deficiencies in the individual and collective security guarantees for the ex-combatants that are provided by the National Protection Unit. Josefina, finally, I will invite to the audience to review sections on territorial implementation that appear in each point of the report, where they will find more information about the implementation in the regions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. I think that was wonderful to hear the 3 approaches coming from you. And again, we hope that already what our audience is going to be finding in our report entices you, because in the future we're going to have many more publications with territorial implementation of the Colombian Peace Accord. Let's now discuss the points of the agreement. One of the characteristics of the 2016 Colombian Peace Accord, besides being the most comprehensive in history, is that it contains very ambitious commitments regarding the transformation of the economic and social condition in rural areas. Tatiana, may I invite you to join us and share with us the commitments for territorial transformation and what we have discovered during this year of monitoring their implementation? Thank you.
Sure, Josefina. As you have mentioned, the transformation of rural areas is crucial for peace building in Colombia. This transformation is outlined in the commitments of point 1 on rural reform and point 4 on solving the illicit drug problem, which include important programs to improving government services, access to land, and reduce social gaps in rural area. But now let's delve into the implementation of those 2 points. By the end of the 7th year, we noticed different trends between point 1 and 4. For instance, point 1 closed the year with 6% of provisions not initiated, as you can see it on the screen, 70% at a minimum level, 18% at an intermediate level, and 6% completed. Over the last year, we saw some changes in the number of provisions not yet initiated, decreasing from 8% to 6%, and in the completed provisions, with increase from 4% to 6%. These changes were possible thanks to some initiatives like the agrarian jurisdiction, the bill to establish unified property tax, and the alignment of the PDET with the transformation of the National Development Plan. Meanwhile, point 4 concluded this period with 3% of provision not yet initiated, as you can see it as well on the screen, 45% at a minimum level, 29% at an intermediate level, and 23% completed. When we compare to 2022, we saw no changes in the implementation levels for this point, including the gender and ethnic approaches, as Yvonne just mentioned before. As a result, we have pointed out that commitments at a minimum level in this point may not meet the established deadline of the final agreement. But moving on to progress beyond all these numbers, in the report we have highlighted significant progress during the year. Both point 1 and point 4 benefited from institutional efforts and programmatic planning, which is essential for achieving this territorial transformation. In terms of point 1, achievements include the mechanisms promoting the comprehensive rural reform in the National Development Plan, as Nicolas mentioned before, such as the direct land purchase mechanism, the reactivation of the National System of Agrarian Reform, and the Special Adjudication Program for Rural Women. It was also a significant year for campesinos, with the recognition of them as a subjects of rights and special constitutional protection, the promotion of campesinos' reserve zones, and the approval of the agrarian jurisdiction. Let's remind that the agrarian jurisdiction is a new court system created to resolve land ownership conflicts in rural areas with a dedicated legal framework to ensure fair and efficient access to justice for all parties involved. Regarding PEDET, the publication of the Pacifico Medio Roadmap is noteworthy, completing the 16 roadmaps for each PEDET subregion. Additionally, territorial participation spaces were created in all PEDET municipalities, and regarding PEDET initiatives, it was increased the universe to 33,007 initiatives, and 43.6% of them were activated at the end of the monitoring period. As for point 4, progress is tied to the momentum provided by the publication of the National Drug Policy, which we expect will allow the national government to retake the implementation of point 4, although gender and ethnic prior consultation are still needed. In addition, the launch of the operational plan against anti-personal landmines defined actions and goals to reduce this type of mines in their territories. However, we have also observed some challenges in the implementation of these 2 points. For example, in terms of land access, while significant results were achieved in terms of land formalization, we saw that the adjudication targets remain unmet. That means that as November of 2023, the target of 7 million formalized hectares had been reached at 30% of them, with 16% allocated to the campesino population and 84% to the ethnic population. Meanwhile, only 1% of the target of 3 million hectares had been adjudicated. Here, I would like to mention that it's important to note that the public data on land access lack uniformity and consistency, underscoring the importance of consolidating and standardizing data and criteria. We have also emphasized in the report that providing detailed and disaggregated information is essential for enhancing transparency regarding land access. I would also like to mention that there is an urgent need to advance in the adoption of missing regulations that will give coherence to the comprehensive rural reform, such as creating coordinating bodies, adopting the National Rural Health Plan, and processing bills related to property tax unification and agrarian jurisdiction operation, which must include judges specialized in the social and economic dynamics of agrarian relations in the rural areas of the country. Regarding PEDET, we also saw persistent delays regarding ethnic-specific initiatives. Implementation and concerns were raised about the cost and time required for action plans for regional transformation to be implemented. Meanwhile, regarding the solution to the problem of illicit drugs, the lack of a differentiated criminal treatment for small cultivators persists, except from a gender perspective with the publication of the Law of Public Utility. Additionally, the report notes the claims of Penese families and ethnic families that presented to the State Council and the Constitutional Court due to the non-compliance and delays in the National Comprehensive Program for the Substitution of Illicit Crops, or PENIS in Spanish. This represents a call to ensure greater transparency and accountability in the execution of the PENIS, and thereby ensure that commitments acquiring point 4 are met. Despite all of those challenges that I have mentioned, we have also observed significant opportunities to improve implementation in the short and medium term. Particularly in point 1, it is essentially relevant for the national government to concentrate efforts on promoting the national agrarian system reform system. This system will impact land access mechanism, the action plans for regional transformation, the national rural reform plans, and even environmental and conflict resolution issues. And of course, updating the 16 action plans for regional transformation is crucial, not only for the new local governments to integrate the priorities of PDET in their planning, but also for communities, especially rural women and ethnic communities, to effectively engage in the design, planning, and execution of these projects in their territories. Moving on to point 4, it is necessary to have permanent coordination between the national government, the CCV, and the territorial instances of the PNIS, so the individual substitution program and the new substitution program are implemented following the principles and objectives of point 4. In conclusion, the progress in point 1 and 4 is in part due to the political will of the government, but it is essential to strengthen the implementation of the national plans for comprehensive rural reform and resume PNIS commitments to achieve effective and lasting territorial peace. With this, Josefina, I think we have mentioned some of the principal progress and challenges of the territorial transformation of the final peace agreement.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. What a great start now in this analysis, point by point. Citizen participation and institutional adaptation are without a doubt also essential conditions for achieving and sustaining peace as per the final agreement. During 2023, the Kroc Institute monitored commitments related to strengthening democracy and closely observed institutional efforts to promote the state's advancement in fulfilling the agreement and assessing its effectiveness. Alejandro, can you share with the audience which were the results and what does the evidence tell us about the commitment's implementation?
Well, as you point out, Josefina, the final agreement establishes as one of its objectives the opening of the political system to new political forces and the strengthening of citizen participation to deepen democracy. For this purpose, a series of commitments were agreed upon in point 2. Additionally, in point 6, a series of institutional mechanisms were created to promote the implementation of the final agreement. This included important issues such as the framework plan for implementations. This is an instrument for planning the implementation into the 15 years period established. In terms of the implementation status of these 2 points, we find that both experienced slight changes during the 7th year of implementation. As of November 2023, point 2 had 26% of provisions not initiated, remaining the point with the highest percentage of provisions in this state. Additionally, 42% of the commitments were in a minimal state, which according to our methodology indicates that 2/3 of the point still lack viability to be completed within the established timeframe. On the other hand, 18% of the commitments were in an intermediate state and only 14% had already completed their implementation. For point 6, as of November 2023, 6% of its provisions were not initiated, 21% were in a minimal state, 14% were in an intermediate state, and 58% had already been completed. This remains the point with the highest level of implementation to date. Of course, during this year, significant progress has been made to drive the implementation of both points. In the case of point 2, we can mention the approval by Congress of the reform to the Electoral Code, which included several measures to strengthen the use of electronic mechanisms in electoral processes with guarantees for conducting audits. We can also mention as another advancement the approval of some legislative measures to strengthen the political participation of women and LGBTIQ+ population, especially regarding the prevention and punishment of violence against them. Regarding point 6, one of the main advances during this period is the functioning of the CCV and its dialogue with the ethnic and women's instances. This has allowed consensus building among the signing parties to advance in several commitments. A second important advancement during this period in point 6 is the launch of 4 new peace radio stations, adding to the 12 already in operation. This represents, of course, progress in the pedagogical efforts of the agreement. But despite these advancements, several challenges in the implementation of these 2 points also became evident during the reporting period. In the case of point 2, the regional elections in October revealed that we continue to face significant challenges regarding security guarantees for political exercise, as there was an increase in levels of political violence during the electoral period, especially against female candidates. Of course, another challenge highlighted by the sinking of the political reform is the lack of consensus among different political forces to transform the political electoral system, especially concerning electoral institutional reform. In point 6, one of the main challenges relates to the allocation of sufficient resources for the implementation of the final agreement. Ensuring at the same time high levels of execution and clear and relevant reports on their utilization. A second challenge of great relevance at this moment is to achieve the alignment of the commitments of the final agreement with territorial development plans, to ensure that actions taken at the local level drive the implementation of the agreement and transform the territories. Of course, the implementing institutions have opportunities to increase implementation levels in these 2 points. In the case of point 2, it is necessary for institutions such as the Ministry of the Interior and the electoral organization to assess the impact of the actions taken to strengthen electoral participation, and in the other hand, to make the necessary adjustments to the strategies developed to meet the objectives of point 2 in the coming years. In particular, it is necessary to strengthen and expand the differential actions aimed at ensuring the political participation of women, LGBTIQ+ population, and ethnic groups. Regarding point 6, the review of the framework plan for implementation is the main opportunity that the CCB has to accelerate the implementation of the agreement. This review could start with indicators facing difficulties and then progress towards the inclusion of new indicators that address issues of the final agreement not included in the framework plan. Of course, the development of this commitment could have a positive cascading effect on several commitments of the final agreement. For conclude, we can observe that during 2023, significant actions were taken to advance the commitments of both points, but efforts must be sustained and accelerated for this to result in a significant increase in implementation levels. Of course, this is just a first glimpse into participation and mechanisms for implementation. Thank you very much, Josefina.
Alejandro, thank you for these notes on participation and verification points. The final agreement proposes an inclusive and sustainable vision of peace for the Colombian people in all their diversity. However, certain population groups were acknowledged to have been impacted severely during the armed conflict, and hence this should enjoy special treatment to break the spiral of violence. These include victims of the armed conflict, past, present, and future ones, and also individuals who chose to sign the peace agreement, lay down their weapons, and enter a process of reintegrating into the social, political, and economic life of the country. Natalia, how did the commitments in these areas perform during 2023?
To talk about the performance of these commitments, Josefina, during the past year, it is important to remind the audience that point 3 is analyzed mainly from the components of reintegration, security, and protection guarantees contained both in point 3 and 2 of the final agreement. Regarding point 5, the parties agreed to adopt measures aimed at ensuring the rights of victims to justice through the creation of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, to the truth, with the creation of the Truth Commission and the Search Unit for persons deemed as missing, and reparation through specific commitments to strengthen the existing reparation policy and articulate it with the new programs and plans created by the final agreement, such as the development programs with a territorial focus, or PEDET, as Yvonne mentioned previously. As to the quantitative analysis, as we can see on the screen, the implementation percentages of point 3 had variations for each of the implementation levels. Compared to the previous period, the most notable change was recorded with the increase of in stipulations from the non-initiated level to the minimum level, going from 19 to 22%. This change corresponds to the approval of the public policy for dismantling of criminal organizations and the commitments derived from it. Regarding point 5, as Alison mentioned, there were changes at all levels of implementation related to the operation of the follow-up and monitoring committee, to the recommendations of the Truth Commission, and the presentation of its first activity report, the consolidation of the universe of people deemed as missing by the search unit, and the presentation before Congress of the project to reform victims' law. With this, as we can see on the screen, the number of stipulations at a complete level of implementation increased by 2 percentage points, from 32% to 34%, and the stipulations at a minimum level increased by 1 percentage point, from 33% to 34% as well. Now, the main advancements recorded in point 3 are related to the approval of important instruments planned to boost the implementation of commitments associated with the reintegration process, the security and protection guarantees. In this sense, the Kroc Institute highlights the following. First, the Comprehensive Reincorporation Program and the National Reincorporation System. Second, the Strategic Security and Protection Plan and the Comprehensive Protection Program for the signatory population and comunes. And third, the dismantling public policy mentioned earlier. It is worth annotating the inclusion and mainstreaming of the gender approach in all these instruments, particularly in the dismantling public policy. Regarding point 5, in addition to the progress previously mentioned, the Kroc Institute highlights that after more than 3 years of requests by women's organizations and LGBTIQ+ people, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace finally formally opened Case 11 on gender-based violence, sexual violence, reproductive violence, and other crimes committed out of prejudice during the armed conflict. Likewise, the report that we are launching today highlights the efforts made by the search unit to territorialize its work, through the reorganization of the existing internal territorial work groups and the creation of new groups in Cesar, Huila, Santander, and Eje Cafetero, or the coffee region in Colombia. However, during the period analyzing the report, we also found some important challenges for the implementation of the final accord. The acts of violence and their effects on the communities and territories in the country represent the main challenge for the general implementation of the final agreement. Although the government made progress in approving important instruments provided for in points 2 and 3 to guarantee the security and protection of different groups of people, the crimes against human rights defenders, signatories of the final agreement, ethnic peoples, women, LGBTIQ+ people, children and adolescents continued, and in some cases increased. For example, as Nicolas mentioned, the Constitutional Court declared an unconstitutional state of affairs in December 2023, due to the persistent and grave violations against human rights defenders and social leaders. On the other hand, victims continue to demand a more effective participation in all judicial processes carried out by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace that contribute to restoration and to their rights. Victims consider that the proposals for restorative sanctions that have been presented so far put the needs of the defendants above their own and do not respond to the victims of the events investigated nor to the territories in which they were committed. On their side, the defendants consider that there is an unjustified delay in the amnesty resolution process. In the report, we mention some specific opportunities to advance the levels of implementation of these commitments. For example, the Kroc Institute highlights that the Peace Agreement Implementation Unit can boost the effective functioning of the high-level forum of the comprehensive security system for the exercise of politics. Additionally, it is important that the unit promotes the implementation of the recommendations of the Truth Commission's final report, including those contained in the specific chapters on the gender and the ethnic approach. Finally, there is an opportunity for the implementation unit to work jointly with the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in the implementation of its restorative sanctions. To conclude, both the point on reintegration and security guarantees and the point on victims of the armed conflict show changes at all levels of implementation. However, it is necessary to find routes of actions that allow progress in those commitments that have not started or are at a minimum level, as well as take measures to overcome challenges that impact implementation, such as those that we have mentioned before. Furthermore, the high degree of dissatisfaction with the judicial proceedings that some organizations of victims, defendants, and peace signatories have expressed is evidence of the need for the Special Jurisdiction for Peace to constantly evaluate the balance between procedural progress and the guarantee of victims' rights. Only in this way, the transitional justice model that the Special Jurisdiction implements will achieve its objectives with high levels of legitimacy. This concludes a first approach to the implementation of the commitments on reintegration, security, protection guarantees, and victims' rights. Thank you, Josefina.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Having addressed the main progress and challenges of the implementation, we now only need to share with our audience the priorities we have identified to overcome the challenges and drive implementation forward. Let us go back to our initial presenter, Nicolás. Nicolás, could you please tell us about the priorities that we have identified and provide an overview on their content?
Of course, Josefina, I would like to briefly mention the 5 general priorities presented in the report. First, the indicators of the framework plan should be reviewed by the CCV, Commission for Monitoring, Promoting, and Verifying the Implementation of the Final Accord, especially those that are lagging behind, that ones do not have technical sheets, and those that establish goals that differ from the final accord. Also, to include commitments that, as of today, do not have indicators in the PMI. A second opportunity directed to the President is to form and convene the Peace Cabinet established in the Total Peace Law, as well as to direct its functions towards the implementation of the final accord. The Kroc Institute considered this cabinet could enhance a comprehensive implementation process. Third, an opportunity was highlighted for the Peace Commissioner in the sense of promoting, in the context of the new peace negotiation, the adoption of humanitarian measures and de-escalation of the conflict in order to facilitate the effective implementation of the peace accord and identify the inherent connections between the agendas of the ongoing negotiations and the current implementation process. As mentioned in the context section, the country is still experiencing multiple armed conflicts, and this has direct implications in the implementation process. The fourth opportunity was directed to the recently created Unit for the Implementation of the Peace Accord and other implementing agencies to promote a strategy to improve coordination of implementation so that interrelated and interdependent processes can progress at the same time while incorporating the gender, ethnic, and territorial approaches more robustly. Finally, to the international community, so it continues to be a fundamental ally in promoting the implementation of the Peace Accord. In this regard, the Kroc Institute has directed an opportunity for the international community to continue with the technical, political, and financial support for the accord implementation, focusing on action that prevent siloed implementation activity while avoiding top-down centralized approaches. Direct efforts towards building capacities in local administration to more effectively engage in coordinated strategic planning for all policy, plans, and programs that must be implemented. Those, Josefina, are the main general opportunities that can be found in the report, and we hope they will be useful for all the interested parties.
Nicolás, thank you so much. We also have our policy brief in English, and it is already available online, and you will find a lot of these recommendations already included there. So I just encourage all our audience to log to our website and find it there. And now I would like to start the second part of this seminar, Not without, of course, thanking very much the entire team for your presentation here today, and to the many other members of the Kroc Institute's Peace Accords Matrix and Barometer Initiative team who make the publication of our reports possible through their research and work with civil society organization, implementation agencies, and stakeholders in the international community. We admire and commend you for your work and your commitment to peace building in Colombia. To start these Q&A questions, we would like to extend our thanks to all the people who sent us questions prior to the launch, and encourage our audience here on Zoom to include any questions they might have still on the chat box. I believe that some of the questions that you had sent in advance might have been already been answered, but so let me focus on the topics that I have here that might still need some discussion and explanation. I will read out the questions exactly as they were sent to us. Let me start with Enrique. Enrique, how is the current government aiding former combatants in accessing land during the reintegration process?
Right, thank you for the question. Well, as it was mentioned in the comparative analysis, the text of the final peace agreement does not include commitments associated with access to land for the reincorporation process. Therefore, since the signing of the final agreement, the Colombian government has created different mechanisms to guarantee access to land for former combatants. Particularly, this government has strengthened some of these mechanisms of routes. One of the established routes, for instance, is the consolidation of the territorial spaces for training and reincorporation, for which the government has bought land for 13 of the 24 spaces. Another of the considered routes or mechanisms is the direct purchase of land from the Special Asset Society. Is the institution linked to the Ministry of Finance that administers assets from illicit activities. Through this route, the government purchases land for productive purposes and allocates it, entitles it to the cooperatives or associative bodies of people in the reincorporation process. The last route, which was promoted by the National Development Plan of this government and which was developed later by the National Light Agency through Agreement 254 of 2023, focuses on extending and adjusting the access land criteria for people in the reincorporation process under cooperatives established within the comprehensive rural reform law. Thank you, Josefina.
Thank you very much, Enrique. I have one question here that I would like to pose to Tatiana. Tatiana, does the new drug policy have any influence on the implementation of the agrarian reform and the substitution of illicit crops?
Thank you, Josefina. Well, this is a very interesting question. We actually, in the report, we believe that the new national drug policy can significantly influence the implementation of rural reform and also the illicit crop substitution. The new national drug policy mentions in one of this chapter the articulation of the final peace agreement, specifically through a model, the comprehensive intervention model. This model, when we review this model, we see a direct connection between substitution programs, the rural reform, and the drug policy, which actually begins with the fulfillment of the substitution programs, moves through land access, participatory planning, and finally involves the delivery of goods and services to the most vulnerable population. And the drug policy also aims to implement environmental management measures and climate actions to mitigate the direct and indirect impact of the illicit crop and the illicit drug economy in the country. This is clearly linked to the National Rural Environmental Plan and promotes substitution in environmentally sensitive areas, which address a long-standing shortfall of the PNIS. All of these aspects are for sure some of the main components of the rural reform and the substitution of illicit crops, and it shows the comprehensiveness that the peace agreement needs and requires to be implemented. However, I like to mention, I would like to mention that it is important to improve security conditions and fostering participatory process for the progress of both the national drug policy and the rural reform.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for that answer. I have here a question I would like to invite Yvonne to please help us answer. What are the main barriers that generate major delays in the implementation of the Peace Accord with the ethnic communities?
Thank you, Josefina. In the A report, we point out different challenges that explain the current state of the implementation of the ethnic approach. But I would like to highlight three of those. First, as Nicola mentioned in the context, there is a continuum of violence and lack of security guarantees, especially in those territories with high presence of ethnic communities as Cauca, Nariño, El Catatumbo, and that made really difficult to implement the different commitments for these communities in the peace agreement. For example, those that have relation to humanitarian demining and different dialogues that need to be take place with the communities. Also, I would like to mention, as I said before in my intervention, the lack of financial and technical sources for the implementation of the prior consultation in different projects of the peace agreement. What is worth saying must be accompanied by the Minister of Interior. In this report, we also document demands from the communities for the absence of the prior consultation in the case required by law. And finally, Josefina, I will say the lack of institutional adjustments that allow the allocation, monitoring, and evaluation of actions aimed to implement the ethnic approach at the ethnic chapter. This translates into plans, resources, and expert personnel, among others, that will help to overcome the obstacles in the implementation of the ethnic approach. I will finish there. Thank you, Josefina.
That's great. Excellent. I have a question here on reparation. May I ask Natalia, can you help us with this? What progress has been made in the collective reparation program?
Thank you, Josefina. Okay, as part of the progress, we highlight in our report the presentation of the project that reforms victims' law. This project stands out for various reasons, but it includes some aspects that impact the collective reparation program. For instance, it links all actors of the national attention and reparation system to the comprehensive plan for collective reparation. It seeks to strengthen economic measures, community rehabilitation, and programs for social development that are included in those comprehensive plans for collective reparation, and it tries to integrate the comprehensive plans with other mechanisms of the final agreement, such as the rural reform plans and the development program with territorial focus. This to prioritize the measures contemplated or included in those comprehensive plans for collective reparations. However, we have found several challenges or difficulties in the implementation of the collective reparation program that have been highlighted by the Institute, not only by the Kroc Institute, not only on this report, but on previous reports as well. For instance, as of November 2023, there were 971 subjects of collective reparations that were included in the victims registry. Of this number, 688 were of collective subjects of an ethnic nature. Of the total of number of collective reparation subjects, only 6.1% had completed the implementation of the comprehensive plans. This means that only 56 6 subjects of collective reparation had implemented or had achieved the implementation of all of the actions and measures included in those comprehensive plans for collective reparation. And even more worrying or worrisome, of those 56 subjects, only 2 were of an ethnic nature or belong to ethnic communities, even though the majority of collective subjects for reparations are ethnic communities or ethnic subjects. But it's not only about the numbers, Josefina. Also, as we have mentioned in previous years, and that was evident in this year of analysis as well, there were challenges regarding the restrictive interpretation of the transformative and reparative approaches of the collective reparation program. For instance, the restriction materializes in the elimination of specific actions of the comprehensive plans that would allow an improvement in the socioeconomic conditions of the subjects of collective reparation. These actions or measures were related to community building, health and housing infrastructure measures, education, among others. Additionally, we found some shortcomings in coordination and articulation with other programs of the final agreement, as the ones included in the rural reform or point 1 of the final agreement, such as the development program with territorial focus and other plans. And also another problem that persists, or another concerns that the Kroc Institute highlights, it's related to the lack of recognition and non-inclusion of subjects of collective reparation in the victims registry. I think those are like the main aspects that could answer the question that was posed.
Thank you. That's great. I have one on political participation. So if I may ask Alejandro to help us with this. What have been the main obstacles that explain why point 2 on political participation has low levels of implementation to date?
Yeah, as we have warned, point 2 and point 1 are the points with the lowest levels of implementation so far. In the case of point 2 specifically, there are several reasons explaining why after these 7 years we still have low levels of implementation. The first reason that I will mention is that several commitments of point 2 need to be processed through legal reforms. And the issue here is that the Congress has not discussed or approved these reforms during these 7 years. It also happens that there are legislative projects that are discussed, but lose elements that implement commitments of the agreement during their discussion. This was what was happening with the last political reform project discussed in Congress. A second reason for this low levels of implementation is that several commitments of point 2 were not included in the framework plan for implementation, which is the main planning instrument of the national government to comply with the agreement. For that reason, several commitments do not even have a concrete responsible, and therefore there have been few actions to their implementation. And finally, we can point out that there has been a lack of more integral and unified action by the entities responsible for implementing point 2. In issues such as strengthening electoral participation or security guarantees for political exercise, we see a great disarticulation in the strategies developed by different institutions. So for these 3 reasons, it would be crucial in this moment to build a clear and unified roadmap to implement the pending commitments of the point. And solve, of course, the problems in the strategies that are already being executed. So that would be my response for now.
Thank you, Alejandro. I mean, we keep hearing this urgent call to make sure that we are implementing those commitments that have already shown delays. I have one that it's a question that we received, and maybe it would also complement this answer very well. Since this relates to the overall accord, may I ask Nicolas to join us? Nicolas, which bottlenecks does the implementation of the Peace Accord face? Thanks.
Sure, Josefina. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for this question. And also, I would like to highlight that the report includes a table of challenges for each 6 points of the Peace Accord. There you will find the actions that will allow overcoming the main obstacles in terms of implementation in the final accord for each point. And now, in the monitoring carried out during 2023, we were able to observe 3 common features across the 6 points that have limited capacity to increase implementation levels. I want to say first of them, the lack of updating the implementation framework plan, although it is true that in March of this year, after 7 years of implementation, the CCB approved the parameters to advance in the process of updating the implementation framework plan. The fact is that this is a lagging issue, as it should be done annually as stipulated by the final accord. This exercise is intended to identify those main bottlenecks in the framework plan indicators, as well as to design work routes that allow progress in implementation. Likewise, to include those commitments that were initially not taken into account in the plan. A second point to highlight here is the need to reach a political consensus to drive forward pending implementation bills. Among them is the regulation of the special agrarian jurisdiction, as my colleagues said before, or the political reform, among others. And lastly, Josefina, I would say one of the main bottlenecks lies in the low budget execution of the resources allocating to implementing the Peace Accord. This has been already alerted by the Office of the Comptroller General and is a fact that the Kroc Institute has documented in its work at the territorial and national levels, as Yvonne said in the previous explanation. So thank you, Josefina. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. Let me go back to this list that we have here. May I ask Yvonne to help us with the following question? How does the Kroc Institute measure the compliance of rural and campesina women's participation?
Thank you, Josefina. We measure women participation in both ways, quantitative and qualitative terms. In quantitative terms, we review how many women can participate and what that means in terms of representation. But we also, in the qualitative way, review the guarantees that the women have to comply with their full participation. We also document the forums in which they participate at the national level, but also at the territorial level, thanks our Barometer's team. We also lead workshops, interviews with women, with different organizations, and also review their own reports about the implementation of the Peace Accord. In this report, we show that in different forums and scenarios, the participation for women face a lot of challenges, despite of the fact that the enormous effort that the women maintain to participate. Actually, women participation remains low compared with men participation, but also they face multiple challenges related to the lack of guarantees to allow their full participation. That means economic challenges, security challenges, also not having safe places for their young sons and daughters while they are participation. And also their interests and needs are not always taken in account in the final decisions in the participation bodies. Also in the plans to do always include their needs. So I will let there that you can find more of these findings in point 2 of our A report. Thank you, Josefina.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yvonne. Considering the time, let me ask just one final question to Natalia. What are the challenges for advancing in the implementation of the recommendations of the Truth Commission? Thank you.
Thank you, Josefina. I think it's important to mention that regarding the recommendations of the Truth Commission's final report, in July 2023, yes, as we mentioned before, the Monitoring Committee presented its first activity report, which included, among other things, a thematic review on the inclusion of the recommendations in the National Development Plan. For this thematic review, the Monitoring Committee organized the 67 recommendations contained in the chapter on findings and recommendations on different topics, and it concluded that 14 of the 67 recommendations of the Truth Commission were incorporated in the final text of the National Development Plan, which represent 21% of the total. This in itself is a challenge because it means that not the majority of the recommendations are being analyzed and are being considered by the Congress and by the government as well. The recommendations included, nonetheless, are related to peace building, victims, democracy, drug trafficking, security, territorial peace, and those aimed at people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. On the other hand, 53 recommendations were left out of the National Development Plan, which means 79% of the total of the recommendations were left out. Thus, the report did not identify the inclusion of recommendations related to issues of impunity, access to justice, and cultural transformations. As mentioned before, this is one of the main challenges because then the government and the entities that are part of the government do not know or haven't acknowledged these recommendations to be included in their own mandates and in their own plans for carrying out the different activities. The report presented by the Monitoring Committee, presented last year, concluded with a specific call to the national government and different sectors to disseminate the Truth Commission's final report and the recommendations contained in this final report in order to be able to consolidate peace, to prevent the repetition or recurrence of past events, and to establish human rights as a fundamental pillar. Additionally, the report also highlights the necessity to incorporate or to include in the mandates of these government entities, not only the recommendations included in the findings and recommendations chapter, but also those specific recommendations included in other chapters of the final report, such as the gender chapter, the ethnic chapter, the children chapter, and other chapters as well. Thank you, Josefina.
Amazing. Thank you all very much to the people who have joined us today. Thank you to all our panelists and especially our communication and events team very much. As the director of the Peace Accords Matrix, I also want to express to everyone listening that the Kroc Institute will always be ready to support and accompany Colombians in the commendable yet often challenging task of negotiating and sustaining peace. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Barometer Initiative team who are now present in many regions across Colombia, as well as our researchers and staff in the United States. The results of this project are possible because of the dedication and commitment with which they carry out each of their activities. I am honored to work alongside a team that without hesitation stands with Colombia's peace and works towards it every day. Finally, thank you very much to all the people who joined us today for this launch event and to the organizations that follow our work and challenge us to innovate and increase our abilities and capacities, as well as to those who have supported us in the development of our mandate in recent years. Have a good afternoon.